Today, we're going to talk about the man who formulated the concepts that form the backbone of our Constitution and our laws. And not just ours, but almost every Western constitution. A man who built a narrative in which there exists something called the popular will that pursues a common interest and takes shape in a social contract, a contract that supposedly we have all signed voluntarily. A tale so deeply rooted and widespread that it's in every political speech, in legal language, in schools, in textbooks, in all our institutions. You could say we live inside that fiction. It's the narrative framework that shapes and defines our society in the very form we know it today. But what if that entire tale was nothing more than the ideological creation of a genius who suffered from severe mental disorders? A man hailed as the father of modern pedagogy, whose ideas still live on in school textbooks, shaping even today how millions of children in the West are educated. And yet, he never raised any of his 5 children. He handed them over to the state, one after another, from the day they were born. Not because he couldn't provide for them, but because he believed this would make him a better citizen by letting the state educate them instead. Meanwhile, he was writing treatises on how children should be educated and harshly criticizing state education. He loved the word freedom so much that he decided to reinvent it, to make it fit into his new political tale. His disorder kept him from accepting the idea of obeying without feeling humiliated. So he found an elegant way out. If obeying felt unbearable to him, it was enough to declare that obeying was being free. From now on, being free would mean obeying the general will. And if you didn't obey, you had to be forced to be free. He was so convinced that he could kill you in the name of your own freedom. And at the heart of this entire tale, he created a single, invisible, abstract idea, an omnipresent idea that justifies everything, the general will. A mystical concept, almost sacred, with no face, no form, that cannot be measured, seen, heard, or touched. It cannot be questioned either, because it is presented to us as unquestionably good and morally superior to everything. An impersonal will, without limits, standing above you, above me, above all of us. And yet, it compels us for our own good. An idea that, though no one has ever seen it, somehow always manifests itself through a chosen few. The general will needs no proof, no demonstration, because what it demands is faith. And like all faith, it also has its absolute morality, its revealed symbolic language, and its prophets. The most famous of them, the first prophet of this secular religion, known in his time as the Prophet of the Republic, was named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He lived in the 18th century. He suffered from chronic delusions. He believed himself the victim of a universal plot conspiring against him. He distrusted even his own dog. He abandoned his 5 newborn children while giving moral lessons to the world and proclaiming himself the great pedagogue of his time. And yet, his word was turned into law. With his writings, Rousseau built a political theology disguised as moral philosophy. He turned the general will into our new political God, omniscient, omnipresent, and omnipotent. He replaced altars with parliaments, priests with deputies, and the Bible with constitutions, solemn texts that, just like the Bible, require interpretation and are proclaimed immutable and eternal above any individual judgment. And why do I say immutable? Because Even though men are born and die, the general will does not age, and it does not dissolve. Its essence remains intact. The general will can only change when the true citizens decide so. That sovereign people of which you and I are not a part. Many have read his works, thinking that the sovereign people and the citizens meant all of us, until, in a footnote to his work, we discovered the truth. When he spoke of citizens, he did not mean you or me, but a very specific political elite. For him, society was divided into 5 types of people: the citizens, the bourgeois, the inhabitants, the residents, and the foreigners. Only one of these groups made up the sovereign people, the citizens. A political elite with the privilege of directly creating the laws and speaking in their own name, what we would call today members of parliament. The rest, like you or me, we are simply inhabitants, people who work, pay taxes, and obey the laws dictated by the true citizens, by the real sovereign people. For Rousseau, sovereignty is not in voting every 4 years or in voicing opinions or in others granting you the right to protest. It lies in the ability to take part directly in making society's rules. Only those who exercise that power directly are truly free and sovereign. The rest of us are inhabitants with illusions, entitled to dream we decide something. Inhabitants, trapped inside a crafted narrative that makes us believe that to obey the laws written by others in our name is to practice citizenship. That being subjects allowed to vote for representatives somehow makes us sovereign, while we go on obeying as what we truly are, subjects of sovereign deputies. Rousseau built a new, secular God, the general will. And with it, he set down the grand dogma that still underpins our political structure. Only what proceeds from that will is legitimate. But not everyone may reach it. Only a chosen few are deemed worthy to grasp it, interpret it, and express it as law. The true citizens. The rest of us, mere inhabitants, cannot aspire to know beyond our individual will, limited, selfish, and ignorant. That is why we must obey, because under this dogma, true freedom does not mean deciding for oneself, it means submitting to those who claim to know that all-powerful will, the deputies, the representatives, the authorized interpreters of that sacred principle, morally superior to everything and everyone. A dogma that after 260 years still rules our lives as naturally as once it was believed that God spoke through the king. Thus begins the story of the greatest political prophet of the modern world, the ideologue of the narrative on which our contemporary democracy was built. The question we ask today is unsettling. What if our democracy was actually born from the delirium of a paranoid mind? Let's answer it directly, no detours. Yes. All evidence suggests that Rousseau developed a complex psychological profile with signs of persistent paranoia and antisocial behaviors that in many ways align with what we now call sociopathy. But we must clarify something important. In the 18th century, psychiatry as we know it today simply did not exist. There were no diagnoses, no clinical labels. But that does not mean such disorders did not exist, only that they had no name. And in Rousseau's case, many have named them since.
The three most prominent biographers, Maurice Cranston, Leo Damrosch, and Jean Starobinski, all agree on one unsettling clinical portrait of Rousseau: chronic paranoia, hypochondria, narcissistic traits, emotional dependency, an obsessive need for approval, and a growing pattern of isolation. But what truly sets Rousseau apart is his extreme emotional hypersensitivity, entirely centered on himself. He felt shame, humiliation, and a deep sense of victimhood, but never remorse for the harm he caused others. These traits, manipulation, lack of guilt toward others, and a self-centered form of empathy, point to a possible sociopathic expression within an antisocial personality disorder, combined with features of a paranoid personality disorder, which over time evolved into a chronic persecutory delusional disorder marked by persistent beliefs detached from reality. These narratives made perfect sense within his own mental framework, but had no grounding in the real world.
To diagnose antisocial personality disorder under the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, commonly known as the DSM-5, requires the presence of at least 3 of the following 7 criteria, which appear on screen: failure to conform to social norms, deceitfulness, irritability, inability to maintain work or honor obligations, and lack of remorse. And not only that, the manual also requires clear signs before the age of 15, although it cannot be formally diagnosed before 18. Therefore, even now, diagnosing it demands a retroactive analysis of childhood. So let's do just that.
Chapter 1. Before 16. The early traces of Rousseau's disorder. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was born on June 28, 1712 in Geneva. At that time, Geneva was a small, independent republic deeply marked by authoritarian Calvinism. His mother, Suzanne Bernard, was the daughter of a pastor. His father, Isaac Rousseau, also a Calvinist, was a cultured watchmaker, passionate about books. The Rousseau family had settled in Geneva a century earlier, part of the Protestant exodus fleeing Catholic persecution in France. But Rousseau's life began with a loss that would mark him forever. His mother died just 9 days after giving birth. Raised by his father until the age of 10, Rousseau developed an intense imagination and a deep love for reading from a very young age. They read together works by Molière, La Bruyère, Fontenelle, but his favorite author was Plutarch. In particular, Parallel Lives gave him a heroic vision of civic duty, personal sacrifice, and Roman Republican virtue, values that would later resurface in his political thought.
But that childhood was cut short once again when he was 10 years old. His father struck a French officer and, to avoid reprisals, was forced to flee the city, leaving young Rousseau in the care of his uncle Gabriel, who worked as a Calvinist pastor. Jean-Jacques' father started a new life in Nyon, remarried, had a daughter, and never saw his son again.
His uncle Gabriel, who had 2 children of his own, decided to send Jean-Jacques and his cousin Abraham to live with Pastor Lambertier and his sister in the small village of Bossy, about 10 kilometers from Geneva. A quiet, rural setting surrounded by nature, Rousseau spent 2 years there until he turned 12. Later, he would remember that time as the only truly happy period of his life. It was the happiest time of my life and perhaps the only time I was truly happy. There, he discovered a simple way of life, unpretentious, with clear rules but without fear and affection, even if it wasn't his own family. That image of natural harmony stayed with him forever, eventually becoming the ideal model behind both his educational vision and his politics. A simple, morally ordered life far from urban corruption.
But not everything was idyllic. In Bassi, he would also endure his first great humiliation. He was accused of breaking a comb. Rousseau denied it again and again, but no one believed him. As punishment, he was beaten with a rod by Mademoiselle Lambercier. But as he would recount years later, what hurt him most was not the blow, but the injustice. Having done nothing, and yet being punished, feeling powerless, discovering that his word meant nothing against authority.
I declare before the entire world that I was innocent. I resisted to the end. I came out broken, but victorious. What tormented me was indignation, anger, and despair. But at the same time that he felt such humiliation, he also discovered that those beatings from Mademoiselle Lambercier gave him sexual pleasure. To be at the feet of an imperious woman, to obey her commands, and to have to beg her forgiveness 1,000 times, were for me ineffable pleasures. This strange taste, always alive, reached the point of madness, even after puberty. This masochistic tendency would largely explain his constant effort to become the victim of all kinds of humiliations throughout his life, even when they were entirely invented.
Biographers like Cranston and Damrosch see in this episode a turning point. From that moment on, 3 traits began to surface that would follow him for the rest of his life: a persistent obsession with injustice, an inability to forgive offenses, and a growing distrust toward any figure of power. And above all, something more intimate and enduring. Rousseau began to convince himself that there was something in him that others could not see, that he alone could clearly perceive the moral injustice of it all, the only one who understood the magnitude of the wrong, the only one truly innocent in a world full of the guilty. From that moment on, his sense of being a victim became part of his identity. At 13 years old, he decided to leave the pastor's home and return to Geneva with his uncle Gabriel. But the sweet, enthusiastic boy had already begun to close himself off from the world. He grew more distrustful, more sensitive, more inclined to feel misunderstood.
As was common at the time, his uncle sought a practical path for him and arranged for a city notary to take him on as an apprentice. But the experience lasted only a few weeks. Jean-Jacques couldn't tolerate the formal, meticulous, rigid nature of bureaucratic routine. In his memoirs, Rousseau himself admitted that he despised imposed authority and found it hard to obey or to fake respect for a profession he held in contempt. After that failure, his father suggested by letter that he be placed as an apprentice to an old acquaintance, a watch engraver named Ducomun, hand engraving dials, numbering mechanisms, decorating the gears. It was a meticulous craft, highly respected within Geneva's watchmaking industry. But Jean-Jacques hated this job as well.
In the Confessions, he recounts how Ducomun kept him under constant watch, making him feel humiliated, observed, and above all, judged. He said he was treated like a criminal under surveillance. And that feeling drove him toward what he would later admit was one of his first conscious transgressions. To get back at him, he began stealing items from the workshop. One of them, a metal awl. But the most revealing part came afterward. When one of the thefts was discovered, Rousseau not only refused to confess, but falsely accused innocent maids. He himself tells of a young woman who was dismissed, and no one ever knew that he had been the one responsible.
In 1728, after almost 3 years in Ducommun's workshop and barely 16 years old, something happened that would change everything. One day he arrived late to work and found the door locked. His master, who had already warned him that he would tolerate no more delays, had left him outside as punishment. Feeling deeply humiliated and judged, Rousseau made a drastic decision. He wanted no more reprimands, so he ran away. I never went back. My decision was made. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew what I was running from. It was his first great escape, but certainly it wouldn't be his last. Chapter 2. A growing disorder and a fractured soul.
Let's pause for a moment. Rousseau has just turned 16, and as I mentioned earlier, to speak of antisocial personality disorder, the DSM-5 requires signs before the age of 15. So, were there any? Yes, and not a few. Just by reviewing his own memoirs and the analyses of his main biographers, we find a clear pattern. He blames others for his thefts, runs away instead of facing consequences, lies, manipulates, rejects all authority, and, most revealing of all, he constantly plays the victim, complains of being watched, yet uses that very claim to justify his crimes. He always finds a greater injustice that, according to him, forces him to act that way. In other words, yes, several criteria for antisocial personality disorder are met before the age of 15. Under current standards, Rousseau would fit a very specific profile: antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic traits and sociopathic expression. Someone who manipulates, lies, and betrays without genuine remorse, yet at the same time plays the victim and considers himself morally superior for doing so. For those who may not know, psychopathy and sociopathy are not clinical diagnoses, but two different ways the same disorder can manifest. Rousseau was not a psychopath. He was not cold, nor indifferent to suffering. Quite the opposite. He was hypersensitive, but only toward himself. What he expresses in his memoirs is not ethical guilt, but an emotional discomfort centered on his own image. He felt shame, humiliation, frustration, and this created an inner contradiction. He did not grieve over ruining the life of an innocent maid. What hurt him was feeling forced to act that way. The problem was not the harm he caused. The problem was how he felt afterward. And it is precisely from that psychological pattern that Rousseau begins to build his political philosophy. A philosophy where the victim is always right, where obeying someone is slavery, and where, paradoxically, true freedom is reached only by submitting to an abstract, invisible, unquestionable will, the general will, an entity that cannot be seen, touched, or questioned. And if you disagree with it, the problem is not the will, the problem is you. According to biographers Maurice Cranston and Leo Damrosch, it is from the age of 16 that Rousseau begins to split his personality. Obedient and submissive on the outside, but rebellious, resentful, and distrustful on the inside. Although there were still no signs of delusions, traits of a paranoid personality had already begun to emerge. He felt observed, judged, watched. He deeply distrusted any figure of authority, took corrections as personal attacks, and built a narrative in which he alone saw the truth, while everyone else misunderstood him, betrayed him, or persecuted him. Only his inner world seemed pure, true, and worthy of trust. This intimate experience would also become political. The idea that human beings are good by nature, but that it is others, society, that corrupts them. Here begins to take root his radical critique of private property, which he would blame for bringing into the world selfishness, ambition, inequality, and oppression. But let's set theory aside for a moment and return to the facts. Rousseau has just turned 16. He has fled Ducommun's workshop. What became of him? Where did he go?
He spent some time wandering, neither studying nor working, while staying at his uncle's house. But feeling judged for refusing to work, he chose to leave Geneva, alone, without money or documents. He felt betrayed by everyone, abandoned by his father, mistreated by his master, misunderstood by his uncle. The world was judging him, and he was convinced he stood alone against it all. Instead of seeking refuge among his own, he fled toward the other side, toward the symbolic enemy of the Calvinists, the Catholics. He set off for Savoy, a Catholic territory where the church ran shelters for young runaway Protestants. He knew he would find protection there, food, a roof over his head, and no need to work. All he had to do was become Catholic. I remembered hearing that the Savoyards gave refuge to fleeing heretics, so I said to myself, if that's true, I won't starve there. And that's exactly what happened. Rousseau formally converted to Catholicism, though he would later admit the whole thing was a sham. I lied when I said I believed. I did it out of necessity.
This rapid change of religion was not an isolated event. It revealed a key trait of his personality: his ambivalent nature, emotionally unstable and at times opportunistic. In fact, years later, he would return to Calvinism, not out of conviction, but to regain the citizenship of Geneva. But let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Once in Savoy, he was taken in by Madame de Warren, a well-connected Catholic noblewoman, 29 years old, with no children. She opened her home to him, offering shelter, education, affection, and stability. She found him work as a copyist, apprentice, assistant, and even taught him music, which would become one of his great passions. Rousseau would try things, get excited, and then abandon them. Always restless, always dissatisfied, she treated him like a son, calling him my little one, my boy, and he called her maman. For years, their relationship was maternal and affectionate, but around 1733, when Rousseau was about 21, that relationship changed. His maman became his lover.
Madame de Vrens was not only his protector, she was his first model of intimate power. Mother, patron, and lover. She gave him security, but also subordinated him emotionally. This emotional ambivalence, the need for love and the inability to handle it without feeling subjugated, is key to understanding his political thought. In his theory of the general will, he projects this very conflict onto the social plane: the desire to belong to a community, but the constant fear of being oppressed by it. He felt an inner emotional conflict. How could he obey an authority without feeling humiliated and without ceasing to feel free? He resolves it with a radical redefinition of freedom. Free is not the one who does whatever he wants, but the one who obeys a law. He is given to himself along with others. If the law comes from everyone, obeying it is not submission, it is freedom. An idea that arises as a narrative to calm his own emotional conflict. It allowed him to obey without feeling humiliated and without ceasing to feel free.
Chapter 3: Rejection, Ambition, and Suspicion. The birth of paranoia. In 1737, Rousseau fell ill and spent 2 months in Montpellier. From that point on, his biographers marked the beginning of a chronic hypochondria. He would spend the rest of his life obsessed with both real and imagined ailments. After recovering, he returned to Madame de Warren's, but nothing was the same. He had become more unstable. She, tired of supporting him, found him a job as a private tutor for an aristocratic family in Lyon, the Bonneau de Mably. It lasted less than a year. His unstable nature, lack of discipline, and extreme sensitivity made it hard for him to hold any job for long. Once again, he felt humiliated, undervalued, disappointed, and he quit the job. He tried to support himself with odd jobs in Lyon, assistant, street musician, but soon grew frustrated and returned to Warren's home, where, according to Rousseau himself, he began to feel like a burden. He was already 30, and it didn't take long before he discovered that Warren's had taken a young lover. Feeling betrayed, he left Savoy for good, heading to Paris.
He arrived in Paris with no money, no contacts, and one fixed idea: to obtain the public recognition that, according to him, he deserved. He worked as a copyist, a musician, a secretary, but jumped from one job to another and ended up falling out with those who helped him. His great obsession at the time was music. He wanted to democratize it, to make it accessible to everyone. So he devised a very simple notation system that anyone could read without knowing solfège. Convinced he had created an absolutely revolutionary system, one that would change music forever, he decided to present it to the Academy of Sciences. But they rejected it. It was discovered that the system had already been created 65 years earlier by a monk, and that it was useless for complex melodies. It was his first great public failure, and a crushing blow to his ego.
Frustrated by his failure in music, in 1743, Rousseau published a harsh critique of French music. That same year, he met Madame Dupin, who hired him as her secretary. Through her, he gained access to intellectual circles where he met many Enlightenment thinkers, including Diderot, who invited him to contribute to the encyclopedia. They started as friends, but years later, Rousseau would accuse Diderot of plotting against him. He didn't just believe Diderot had betrayed him, he began to convince himself that everyone was spying on him, mocking him, trying to destroy him. It was the beginning of his paranoia. That same year, he secured a position as secretary to the French ambassador in Venice. He was euphoric: salary, prestige, travel, and stability. But it all ended badly. His pride couldn't bear being overlooked. He was dismissed in less than a year. In 1744, at the age of 32, he returned to Paris humiliated and wrote a memorandum denouncing the diplomatic corps. The tone already echoed what would define his thought: victimhood, outrage, and accusations against power. He resumed work with Madame Dupin. Interestingly, the only relationships he seemed able to maintain were with women. With men, the pattern repeated itself: tension, conflict, and rupture. During this period, he met Voltaire, d'Alembert, Rameau, and also hired an illiterate young maid, Marie-Thérèse Levasseur, with whom he would have 5 children. Chapter 4: The Great Pedagogue Who Abandoned His Children.
All his children, the 5 of them, were abandoned, one after another, in a Paris orphanage, where the mortality rate in the first year exceeded 84%. Rousseau himself recounts how he had so little concern for their possible identification that he even refused to register their date of birth. It is believed that all of them died. As for Thérèse, Rousseau spoke of her as a mere instrumental object, for whom he felt no affection and no respect, which should hardly surprise us because Rousseau believed that women existed solely to serve men, to please them. He would later put it in writing in Emile.
Man must be strong and active. Woman must be weak and passive. That woman is especially made to please man. Women in general neither like nor understand art and have no talent for it. They may succeed in trivial tasks that require only superficiality and a bit of taste, but are utterly lacking in depth. They do not know how to describe or feel love.
As for the abandonments, they were not accidents. They were premeditated and repeated decisions. Rousseau describes how Thérèse refused and cried, and how he manipulated her and pressured her until she finally gave in, sobbing. He would even call Thérèse's mother to calm her while he left with the newborn, heading to the orphanage. The great question here is, what drives a man to bring children into the world only to abandon them one after another consciously and deliberately?
Years later, Rousseau would try to justify this cruelty with astonishing arrogance and coldness. And no, it wasn't poverty, it wasn't lack of resources. His reasons shifted depending on the moment. In a letter from 1751, he claimed the children were an obstacle to his genius. How could he possibly write with a crying baby at home? How was he supposed to find the peace of mind needed to focus on his work? He also played the victim, claiming he'd rather leave his children orphaned than condemn them to grow up with a father who, in his view, had already been corrupted by society. Worse yet, he handed them over to the state to save them from being corrupted as well. Later, in his confessions, he tried to elevate abandonment to the level of a civic act. He claimed to have handed his children over to public education, as a good citizen would in Plato's Republic, where children belong not to their parents, but to the state. But in his own memoirs, he also hints at another reason. He didn't want his children growing up surrounded by Thérèse's family, whom he despised as poor, uneducated, and vulgar. He'd rather they died in an orphanage than be raised by that riffraff.
None of this shows the slightest real remorse toward others. He does not speak of his children's suffering nor of Thérèse's pain, only of his own discomfort, his emotions, his need to write. He never takes responsibility, and certainly never thinks of apologizing. He only builds elaborate justifications to rationalize what he did. He was always the victim of a corrupt and unjust society, of circumstances, of power, of his surroundings, and at the same time, he presented himself as morally superior, the one who sacrifices his fatherhood for civic virtue, proving himself a better citizen by handing his children over to the state, acting for the common good, and sparing them an unworthy life.
When Voltaire learned of these events and heard Rousseau justify abandoning his children as a patriotic act, compare himself to Jesus Christ, demand statues in his honor, and insult anyone who disagreed with him, he thought Rousseau had completely lost his mind. In 1764, 2 years after Rousseau wrote The Social Contract and his book on education, Voltaire anonymously published a pamphlet titled The Sentiment of Citizens, warning the people of Paris that Rousseau had crossed the line into madness. Who is this man who believes statues should be raised to him and with the same humility compares his life to that of Jesus, who insults Christianity and the Reformation and derides our rulers and pastors? Is he a scholar speaking against other scholars? No, he is a syphilitic wretch dragging behind him from village to village and mountain to mountain a prostitute, whose mother he has killed and with whom he has had children and abandoned them at the doorstep of an orphanage. In other letters, he was even more blunt, saying Rousseau was literally insane and trying to convince everyone that the only mad ones were everyone else, but not him. This man is insane. There is no reasoning with him. Rousseau writes like a madman, trying to convince us that we are the ones who are insane. Rousseau denied having syphilis and killing Therese's mother. He also tried to hide the truth about abandoning his children. It was many years later, in his confessions, that he finally admitted it and tried to justify it. Chapter 5. From idle to paranoiac, when admiration turned to horror.
The most puzzling thing is that Voltaire did not always think this way about Rousseau. At first, he deeply admired him. When he read Émile, his treatise on education, he was so impressed that when he learned the French Parliament had ordered Rousseau's arrest, he wrote him a letter, offering him refuge in his own home in Ferney. He told him,
"I will always love the author of the Savoyard Vicar, no matter what he has done or will do. Let him come here. He must come. I will welcome him with open arms. Here he will be more master than I. I will treat him like my own son."
But that initial admiration soon turned into disbelief and later into contempt. And not only in Voltaire's case, it was a common pattern. Those who read him admired him. Those who knew him were horrified.
Madame d'Épinay, who hosted him in her home, wrote in her memoirs that he was so ungrateful that no one could live with him without getting hurt. She couldn't understand how someone so excitable, distrustful, and emotional could write such noble and rational texts. Grimm, his former friend, was even more blunt. He has no right whatsoever to speak about morality. His life is a continuous scandal. Diderot, who initially considered him an intellectual brother, ended up completely disappointed. In a letter to Madame d'Épinay, he confessed, "Rousseau is sick in his soul, incapable of sincere friendship. He interprets everything as betrayal."
You can't imagine what he did to David Hume. The Scottish philosopher, who admired him deeply, welcomed him with open arms in England when he had to flee France, found him lodging, defended him in public, even secured a pension from King George III so he could live in peace. And what did Rousseau do? Suddenly, he began claiming it was all a conspiracy, that Hume, Voltaire, Diderot, the King of England, and half the world had joined in a plot to destroy him. He even accused the king of trying to bribe him. He wrote that the royal pension was a bribe, meant to humiliate him publicly. Fortunately, George III chose to ignore the accusations, taking into account his mental state. But Rousseau kept sending letters, absolutely delirious ones. He accused Hume of spying on him, of manipulating his partner Teresa, of getting into his head. According to Rousseau, Hume had somehow made the dog act suspiciously. He actually thought they wanted his dog to be part of the plot. Literal. To give you an idea of the level of paranoia, Rousseau was convinced that Hume was staging what he called petit tourments, little daily mental tortures, to defile and humiliate him. And one of the most absurd and ridiculous episodes had to do with a look in a portrait.
Hume helped Rousseau commission a portrait that Rousseau himself wanted. But when he saw the finished work, he flew into a rage because, in his view, the expression in his eyes had been deliberately altered to make him look disturbed. He accused Hume of conspiring with the painter as part of a plot to ruin his reputation. The scandal was so great that Hume ended up publishing a pamphlet in French and another in English, a concise and genuine account of the dispute between Mr. Hume and Mr. Rousseau, to defend himself against the accusations, unable to believe what he was experiencing. In the end, frustrated and completely baffled, Hume wrote, "He suffers from an incurable disease of the heart, excessive pride, pathological sensitivity, and a tendency to imagine persecutions and plots where none exist. The story I have lived with Rousseau is incredible and inconceivable. If it were not based on such authentic documents, surely there has never been so much evil and madness combined in a single human being." Rousseau is one of the worst men, perhaps, who has ever existed. To Adam Smith, he confessed, Rousseau is either a consummate villain, a complete madman, or both. My opinion is the latter, but it seems to me that the villain dominates his character more. And Adam Smith replied, My dear friend, I am fully convinced that Rousseau is as shameless as you believe and as everyone here knows. In another letter to his friend Hugh Blair, he concluded, It is impossible to describe the degree of madness he has reached. His mind is completely dominated by delirium.
I've been reading a lot of letters from that time, from Voltaire, from Hume, from Rousseau himself, and from many other figures of the era. And I can assure you, it's pure telenovela. But what nobody doubted, not in Paris, not in Geneva, not in London, was that Rousseau was not exactly in his right mind. In the letters and writings of the time, it's very clear. Rousseau didn't just deeply distrust everyone. He invented conspiracies without limits, manipulated people against each other to make them enemies, and twisted reality to convince himself he was the victim of some enlightened elite determined to destroy him. And the most curious thing is that, after writing the works that made him famous, all the great Enlightenment thinkers admired him. They spoke well of him, sought him out, wanted to meet him. The gap between Rousseau's ideas and his personality was so obvious to those who knew him that many could not believe he was truly the author of his own works. In fact, it became one of the gossip topics among the aristocrats of the time. The disappointment was almost inevitable. His texts radiated nobility, reason, and virtue, but his character was the complete opposite. Egocentric, hypocritical, unstable, paranoid, emotionally unbalanced, even hard to endure. That was Rousseau, a man whose writings inspired ideals of virtue, but whose real life inspired pity, confusion, and even fear. He was, without a doubt, brilliant, but also profoundly disturbed.
Chapter 6. When delirium became religion and reality. Rousseau's delusions began around 1762. The same year he wrote Émile, his great pedagogical work, and The Social Contract. By then, he had already written to several acquaintances, like Diderot and Grimm, claiming there was a universal conspiracy to destroy his reputation. He started severing ties with old friends, accusing them of being conspirators. These delusions grew stronger, more constant, and increasingly detached from reality. In 1765, he began writing The Dialogues, a work in which he split his personality into three voices: Jean-Jacques, the author, Rousseau, the accused, and a fictional judge tasked with deciding who was telling the truth. He could no longer trust even himself. This text already shows a clear level of mental dissociation and paranoia. But it was in 1766 that he truly spiraled into distrust, persecutory delusions, and absurd accusations. He was convinced that everyone was spying on him, betraying him, pursuing him. Even his closest friends in his mind became hidden enemies. From then on, the paranoia became chronic. Rousseau isolated himself, lived like a fugitive, and spent his final years writing defenses against enemies who existed only in his mind. In his final years, he came to see himself as a misunderstood prophet, persecuted for speaking the truth. A martyr of virtue. He compared himself to Socrates, to Jesus Christ, to the great sages unjustly condemned by humanity. His delirium was no longer a mere episode, it had become his new identity.
But don't think that this idea of seeing himself as the prophet of a new religion only appears in his final years, when the delusions were already chronic. Long before that, Rousseau was already building a religion, and he was its prophet. In the social contract, the final chapter is not casually titled on civil religion. That closing section is not about spirituality, but about a political religion designed to morally sustain the state. Rousseau claims that every republic needs a common faith, one that does not divide but unites, and that must replace traditional religions, because they are incompatible with the dogmas of modern state citizenship. He does not propose a church, or miracles, or saints. He proposes a new political, institutional, and moral narrative, mandatory for all citizens. And at the center of this new faith is not God, but the general will, an invisible, infallible, unquestionable entity, a kind of secular God. And like every God, the general will presents itself as omnipresent. It is everywhere, speaking to us through constitutions, laws, regulations, even political speeches. It is omnipotent because it nullifies any individual will that contradicts it, imposing itself above all others without exception. It is omniscient because it is said to know what is best for everyone, even if no one has consciously expressed it. And of course, it is unappealable. It never makes mistakes. Because if it did, it would no longer be the general will. It would be just another opinion. Rousseau lays out his secular Holy Trinity like this: the social contract as the founding act and sacred text, the general will as the invisible sovereign God, and the common interest as its supreme commandment, undeniable and sacred. But he goes even further. In Book 4 of Emile, in the chapter known as The Profession of Faith of the Savoyard Vicar, Rousseau sets out, through the voice of a fictional priest, the principles of a natural, rational, universal religion. A personalist faith, based on individual conscience, natural law, and virtue as the center of the human soul. There is no revelation, no tradition, only an inner voice that conveniently happens to match his own. Diderot and Voltaire quickly saw the danger. Rousseau didn't just want to transform politics. He wanted to replace traditional religion with a new spiritual architecture, built to his own measure. As if that weren't enough, in his final work, Reveries of the Solitary Walker, Rousseau no longer presents himself as a thinker, but as the chosen one. He writes in the third person, wandering alone, portraying himself as a misunderstood martyr, cast out from the world by his moral purity. He compares himself to Socrates, to Christ. His pain takes on a redemptive dimension. His isolation, a moral justification. His truth, a mandate. He never openly said, "I am the prophet of a new religion." But everything in his attitude suggested it. In his view, he was the only one able to see what others could not. The only one who could distinguish between the individual will, selfish, clumsy, flawed, and the general will, pure, sacred, unquestionable. And who can hear this general will? Only those who are citizens in the full sense, the chosen ones, those who need no representation, who vote directly on the laws and speak in the name of the sovereign body. The rest, the inhabitants, the taxpayers, those who live in the city but are not part of the sovereign political body, can only obey. Why? Because believing in the general will is a matter of faith. And it's true that in the social contract, Rousseau writes as if we were all citizens. It's easy to fall into that trap. I must admit, I was fascinated the first time I read it, until I reached chapter 6. Well, anyone might think the author was practically an anarchist. I thought so myself. But of course, I was very naive. Because I was reading the book thinking citizen meant the same as it does today, and it doesn't, not at all. Everything changed when I reached footnote 3 in chapter 6. That's when I began to understand. When Rousseau speaks of citizens in the social contract, he doesn't mean all the inhabitants. In fact, he makes it very clear that such a thing was, to him, an absolute abomination. According to him, only two kinds of people make up the sovereign people: the citizens, a political elite that votes directly on the laws and needs no representatives because they speak in their own name, and, in certain cases, wealthy bourgeois who possess enough riches or property. The other three classes of men he defines are the inhabitants, the residents, and the foreigners, and none of them are part of the sovereign body. These people are not citizens. They simply pay taxes and tributes and submit to the general will. They have no voice. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? When Rousseau says the people, he does not mean everyone. He means only those few who can express the general will. And how do you tell who can and who can't? Well, basically, it's a matter of faith, a political faith, an almost religious belief that some, the true citizens, are able to hear that general will which others can't even comprehend. And this is where one begins to wonder, are we truly looking at a rational thinker, or at someone who, little by little, was building a delusion in the shape of a political theory? And many of you will say, fine, maybe he was a sociopath with paranoid personality disorder who ended up having delusions, but that doesn't mean his work isn't brilliant, rational, and deeply influential. And you're right, his life does not invalidate his thought. This is not a personal attack. It's an invitation to look at the whole picture, to understand what vital need, what emotional conflict, what psychic wound an author is projecting when he writes, and why his texts have that intoxicating, messianic, moralizing tone. It is not the same to read a philosopher who seeks the truth with humility as it is to read a man who believes he has been chosen to impose it. And although the analysis of the social contract and its content we will leave for another video, believe me, knowing his life does not invalidate him, but it does illuminate him. It gives him context, and it gives him meaning. What I can assure you is that all this paranoia, this need for redemption, this conviction of being right against everyone, Rousseau turned it into political theory. And the most unsettling thing is that this theory still shapes the very framework of the world we live in today, the matrix we can't see, but that we all live inside.